I'm Scott Alan Miller, and this is my life living in León, Nicaragua. As many of you know, my last week and a half has been absolutely crazy. I'm working on a giant project, which is going well, and I'm very happy with it, and I'm very excited to be able to work on this technology project that I talk about a little bit on the live stream. I'm not really putting too much on here. I did an episode about it, like that's plenty. But it's going well, but it is taking all my time. I'm recording this on Sunday, so happy Sunday, everybody. We're still in the pumping out shows as the days happen, and I'm scrambling to get them out and putting them out at the end of the day. This is a tip for those of you who want to know. If I put out shows at the end of the day, chances are I'm scrambling. If I put them out at the beginning of the day, chances are I have them booked out ahead of time. It's not 100% true, and sometimes that changes as I gauge things, but it's a little bit of a guide. But it is a beautiful Sunday. It's nice and clear, but we're very sad. We went to order some Pizza Hut today, and Pizza Hut and most of the pizza places that we like to order from have been removed from Petito's Jaw. We don't know what's going on. There's one terrible pizza place that we refuse to order from. There's one we don't like very much, one that only I will eat, and then another one that's really terrible. It's rough, right? There used to be a number of pizza places, and the number is getting smaller and smaller. There's one or two that are still pretty good, but they're the expensive, like, gourmet places, not like normal everyday pizza. So we're a little bit sad about that, but we're going to be making homemade mac and cheese tonight. It's Sunday, so my daughter Luciana and I like to cook together. We've done falafel burgers like a week ago. We've done eggs Florentine a few days ago. Today we are going to be doing baked mac and cheese, which is not a super special thing, but it is not like, you know, just normal box mac and cheese. Like, we grate a pound of sharp cheddar and do the whole thing in the oven. It's a little event. It's a thing we do together, and we really enjoy it. And everybody's looking forward to it, so that's kind of what we're doing on a Sunday. I've had a crazy morning. We had one of my customers had a massive outage, and I and my team have been scrambling to deal with help desk messages and communicating with people and dealing with that all day. So as my morning was completely lost to that. Tomorrow is the 30th, and that means that Marcela, who has been on the show a lot, is having her 12th and final, we sure hope, chemotherapy treatment for her stage 4 Hodgkin's lymphoma. She is hoping that her grandmother is able to spend the day with her, so that's why I'm here in León and not out in Managua to help out with that. And with fingers crossed, this is going to be it. She will be sick for about a week from that, but after that, she should be done. She has a break. During July, they're going to do the test, get all the stuff, the status of her post-chemotherapy position, and then get ready to start radionuclear medicine for her thoracic tumor that they need to work on next. So that's where we are, and today we're going to be talking about how to really define the third world and why our ways of thinking about it are completely wrong. We're going to get to that right after the bump. Most people know that the history of the concept of the first, second, and third world date back to the Cold War. The first world simply referred to those countries that were aligned in the sphere of influence of the United States. The second world, those that were aligned with it in the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. And the third world were the unaligned countries. This was purely a political thing back in the 1950s, 1960s. Over time, however, it became pretty well known that for the majority of the world, the countries that were aligned with the U.S. were relatively wealthy. Those that were aligned with the Soviet Union were less wealthy, and those that were unaligned had a tendency to suffer economically, or at least have lower GDP. Of course, the GDP number coming from the first world countries as a way to make them look good, because it's a number specifically chosen because it's something that is high in those countries, rather than being something that reflects something that is good for us. It is something that reflects the commonalities of the first world, and so it's kind of a reverse metric, right? If you were in a position where you had a group of people and you wanted to make them look good, you would seek a metric that favors them, rather than seeking a group of people that favor a metric you've demonstrated or believe logically represents something that you want. And so over time, the concepts of what is the first and third world have migrated quite a bit, and the idea of the second world has mostly disappeared. People don't talk about it, and a lot of people are kind of surprised to find out that it even exists. We think it's something like first-person shooters and third-person shooters. Where's that second-person shooter? It doesn't exist, but it would be interesting to make one, of course. Now, what the modern definitions of first and third world mean are interesting, because mostly they've morphed without any kind of official definition, but we all assume that first world nations are rich and developed and third world nations are poor and undeveloped. And I think most people kind of understand that there's a number of places that likely fall in between the two, and that it's not the whole world is first and third. But people have a tendency to kind of imagine that it is and forget that we never define a country as being in between, but that's okay. When we're looking at these countries, though, we think of third world countries as being very poor, and that makes sense, but we don't step back and start to define what it means to be poor, and I think that's worth doing, because what countries from the first world generally want us to do is look at this GDP number. GDP numbers can be easily gamed. I've got videos from years ago where we talked about how it's very easy to go out and fake a GDP number, and why even if it's not fake, it doesn't actually reflect something super meaningful. And even if it is reflecting something that we assume to be meaningful, it doesn't necessarily have a positive effect or a positive result when it comes to individual people. Of course, we can assume that there are commonalities. With higher GDP is probably better than a lower GDP, and that's probably true most of the time. All other things being equal, that would make sense, but it's not tied to things in that way. Much like you might say, well, having a higher speed limit is better than having a lower speed limit. It reflects that people are driving more safely, or that getting places makes more sense quickly because you have things to do, or that you have higher quality roads. And those things would often go together, but a small country that only has, dirt roads could still just not bother having a speed limit because they assume that the potholes will slow you down. If you drive too fast and ruin your car, that's on you. And so you could end up with completely backwards results from what you're expecting if you just take a metric out of context. The other thing that people promoting the GDP mentality of first and third world concepts is that money has an absolute value, but that is not the case, right? We have a tendency to think that having lots of money makes you able to do more things and having little money makes you able to do less. But the reality is that while, again, all other things being equal, that's generally true, we are looking at it in a vacuum. In the real world, what we care about is what you're able to get with your money, not how much of that money you have. Simply having tons and tons of monopoly money, for example, doesn't make you rich because that money doesn't buy you anything. But someone could argue that they have outrageous amounts of it, right? So this is a funny concept because people will well, that's monopoly money, but there's a lot of situations where people are accumulating lots of money that they can't necessarily go use somewhere, or it turns into that, right? And we see a lot of this in the U.S., Elon Musk being a perfect example. People like to say, well, he's worth $500 billion. You're like, okay, can he go cash out and get that $500 billion? Is it possible to have that money in cash? Well, no. If he was to cash out, one, there's a bunch of things that would stop him from doing so, so he's not able to actually accumulate that $500 billion. And if he was to sell that much of his stock, the value of that stock would plummet. The amount that he could actually get if he was to cash that out would be a fraction of that $500 billion. It's still a lot of money, of course, but it's not anywhere near the amount of money that someone claims. And the famous example that we give of this is if you want to try this out, you can issue stock from your own company. Go form a new company, take stock at a value of $1, give yourself $1 of stock, and then issue that you buy, and then issue 1 trillion stocks, and then trade one of them to a friend for $1. You now have, by the same measure that gives Elon Musk $500 billion, you now have twice that. You have $1 trillion. The moment you try to actually go collect from anyone, it will be worthless. But on paper, using the system that we generally use to determine people's wealth, you would have $1 trillion. It's a very silly example, but it shows just how easy it is to game, and the GDP numbers are similar, that you and a friend could simply hook up a computer program that trades $1 back and forth 1 trillion times per day and have the world's largest GDP, just the two of you, and you could do it anywhere. You could move to Zimbabwe, run this program, and suddenly Zimbabwe would have the world's largest economy by GDP, even though it has produced absolutely nothing additional, and no one in the country was even aware of it. As long as you could report that that $1 had moved back and forth trillions of times per day, its GDP would jump by trillions of dollars per year. It's an insane system because it's based on nothing. It's smoke and mirrors. If people don't game it too much, it tends to seem a little bit reasonable, but it's always gamed quite a bit. And we talk a little bit about the example of building furniture. If you were to build the same couch in Nicaragua or in the United States would, for the same amount of total money and total amount of product being built, assuming both are made by hand, both are made using the same materials, both sell for $2,000 at the end of the day, the U.S. would report several transactions where one business did one part and moved it to another, and you may report $10,000 worth of GDP growth from selling a $2,000 couch. In Nicaragua, you may only report $2,000 for that $2,000 couch, simply because it's all done under one business umbrella versus multiple components in the other country. They simply work differently, and one is built to make GDP a big number, and one is designed to kind of hide it or minimize it. And not necessarily for those reasons, but the way that they work does that. So we have to understand that these numbers are meaningless as a starting point. And even if you have people with the same amount of money, I've got $500 of US dollars over here and I have $500 of US dollars over there, they do different things in different places. So we have to consider what people actually have and what they're able to do with that money. So what does that mean in the context of comparing first and third world? Well, what we really need to step back and say is, okay, money doesn't matter, GDP doesn't matter, income doesn't matter. None of those things are actually relevant. They may be useful when we're comparing two nearly identical countries, the US and Canada, for example, and we want to have a reasonable way of talking about rough sizes of their economy and rough buying power of the individual people, and that may give us a very rough way to do so, and that could be roughly accurate. You notice there's a lot of hedging in that, but it generally gives you something sort of useful. But once you start comparing differential economies, right, high disparity economies such as the US and Cuba, it's absolutely meaningless. Nothing in Cuba generates GDP, even though they're doing work. And it doesn't mean that Cuba's rich. They're not, but they're able to do a lot more for the same GDP. Just those activities don't show up in GDP numbers most of the time, whereas the US can produce nothing and still have a high GDP. Not that the US produces nothing, it produces an awful lot, but it's not reflected in what the GDP actually is. The numbers are wildly different. So what we actually care about is buying power in lifestyle buying, not your ability to buy a laptop or your ability to buy a movie ticket, but in the overall, how much lifestyle are you able to get for the same money or the same effort in two different places. Now, we can start to look at a lot of different things throughout life, and one of the things that becomes very problematic for the same reasons we just mentioned about how economies are very different is that lifestyles are very different. If you're going to be here in Nicaragua, which is what we're going to be using as an example, people have a tendency to naturally spend their money when they have extra money on going out, things like restaurants and music and services and activities. Americans have a tendency to go out and spend their money on things like televisions and movies and video games and things like that, physical objects in most cases versus services in the other. And this is just kind of the way that society works, but some of this is generated by other parts of the economy, right? In the United States, we have very, very, very cheap luxury goods in a lot of cases, so it makes sense that we're able to spend reasonable amounts of our excess money to get lots of luxury goods, but going out is expensive. And in Nicaragua, going out is relatively cheap, but acquiring luxury goods is relatively expensive and often causes our money to flow out of the country, whereas in the US, that money tends to stay in the country. So we have a tendency not to do those things in the same scale when we have the same rough amount or percentage of excess money, just two different behaviors based on what's available and how things work. So comparing the two is very difficult. If you were a Nicaraguan and you want to make Nicaragua look good, you would say things like, well, how easy is it for you to hire a maid? And an American would be like, that would be crazy amounts of money for me to hire a full-time maid. And an American who wants to make the US look good would be like, but what does it take for you to buy a 72-inch TV? And a Nicaraguan would be like, I don't even know where I can find a 72-inch TV in the store. 60 is like the limit that I'm going to be able to find, and I'm going to pay 3 times what you do, right? And that's going to be how they're going to try to trick the numbers. So we can't use those things because they're misleading, because each country gets different benefits. And so there's no direct way to do a comparison. You can't just look at a cup of coffee and look at a breakfast and look at a service and look at a TV. You have to say which things matter to people, how are they able to acquire them, how much is that is something they control. Like, for example, can Americans somehow hire services from abroad to mitigate what it costs for those services in the US? And in some cases, yes. In many cases, no. Can Nicaraguans source their products from the US or from China directly and not be beholden to local prices? In many cases, yes, but not all cases, and so forth, right? So there's this big way of comparing that is absolutely ridiculous trying to do those things. And in general, we don't care too much because in most places, you're able to use excess money in a good way, one way or another, and everyone will argue about what matters to them in any particular case. And so we're really into a subjective thing. It is worth noting that I feel like the basic things like going out to eat and hanging out with people, Americans and Nicaraguans are basically able to do this in very similar amounts. Loads of Americans can't afford to go out. Loads of Nicaraguans can't afford to go out. Tons of the middle class of both are able to go out on a relatively regular basis. it's not as different as it may seem. I do feel like people are able to go out more easily in Nicaragua, which is shocking because, like we talked about, the GDP numbers suggest that the per capita income is way lower, just a tiny fraction of the U.S., and yet they're able to go out at roughly similar or possibly higher rates. That's amazing. People who are living here on relatively low income will complain if they're not able to go out 3 or 4 times a week. An American who's making very solid middle-class money would be pretty shocked that they would ever be expected to go out 3 or 4 times a week. If they did, it'd be like, wow, you're really putting a lot into being able to go out. So it's an amazing difference there that I think really shocks people. But if we step back and talk about what would really matter, I think we can come up with a few things that we could define as being truly meaningful when comparing the first to the third world. And I'm going to propose the idea here. I don't think it's useful to try to compare the first and third world by how much your excess money can buy. What matters is what society is able to provide. We live in a world where anyone who has excess money can get things for it, whether it's physical things or services, one way or another, no matter where you live in the world, excess money works in your favor really well. But when it comes to the basics, we're talking about food, quality food, right? Can you get healthy food? Can you get good housing? Can you keep from being homeless? And are you able to live without working really, really long hours? And are you able to get health care? These are basically the things that define the basics. These are the survival numbers. These are the things you have to really be able to live. And when we look at these, I think it's very telling. So we would define, I think, the first world as being places where being able to acquire healthy food is generally available to the bulk of the population. You're not stuck in food deserts. You're not stuck getting solely GMO'd food or chemically altered food or very dangerous food, right? You're not stuck with snack food. You're able to get fruits and vegetables. You're able to get quality ones, healthy ones, and so forth. Housing, that you're able to provide housing that is safe, that you're able to, and I forgot safety, that you're able to live safely. Right. That one is a little bit less directly tied, I think, to first versus third world, but it is important. Obviously, it's important, but I think it's important to the discussion. But shelter, that you're able to live safely and be out of the elements, be able to deal with the healthiness of having an indoor environment, that you're able to work, right? That not only are you able to work, but you don't have to become a slave. You actually have time to be a healthy, happy individual. And of course, healthcare is a really important one. You have to have that access. Like, you shouldn't be in a position where, based on your job or based on whatever, that you're not going to be able to have access to healthcare. You shouldn't be afraid of being able to get healthcare. These are the basics, right? These are things that come before you can really start to say you have excess money. If you don't have these things, never do you have excess money. You may choose to starve. You may choose to work an outrageous amount of hours and stress yourself to an early grave. You can choose to be homeless if you really want, and use the money that you save from doing those things to go out and call it excess money, but it's not really excess. You're not meeting the true basic needs. So you have to meet these basic needs before you can start to consider what's excess. If people have to give these things up, then they don't truly have excess, right? Then we're cheating the system. This is where the first and third world starts to be an interesting comparison. So if we were to look at the most prominent examples, and this is interesting because the United States obviously is the poster child for the first world. It is the country around which the first world rallied. The entire concept of the first world was based on the U.S., and the reason that first world is meant to, or has come to mean, super rich is because the U.S. is the prototypical first world country. Nicaragua has long prided itself on being the prototypical third world country. It just happens to be that I live and do my videos in the country that takes super amounts of pride in being the third world country. It's not just that it's seen as part of the global south. It's not just that it's seen as a low-income country. It's not just seen as being a small country. It's not just seen as being a Latin American country, all things often associated with the third world, but it is also an early member of the non-aligned movement, or the unaligned movement, which is the core political movement uniting the third world, right? Countries that intentionally did not choose to be part of the U.S. or part of the Soviet sphere of influence, but were like, we are not beholden to anybody. We're just independent countries. And they were a spearhead of that in the early days. So they have taken being a third world country from a political thing and from an economic thing very seriously and very pridefully. And so Nicaragua has long been a country that the United States and the other first world countries look to as an example of the third world, and Nicaragua has really in every possible way kind of embraced that and run with it, right? Whereas you could say like Guatemala or some other countries in the region which are economically more similar and demographically more similar and geopolitically more similar, but they still have a little bit of American alignment, for example, and so it's a little bit, they may still be third world countries, but they are not as completely clean, far and away, third world in the way that Nicaragua is, where it really meets the definition going back to the very beginning. So Nicaragua is the absolute perfect example of the third world. And when we compare Nicaragua to the United States using what we would come up with as meaningful guidelines as to whether a country is first world or third world, I think we fall into the same position that some writer from Germany said, right? The United States is the nicest third world country I've ever been to, which is a strange way to put being in the United States. I would say I've never been to a third world country that wasn't nicer than the U.S. for visiting, but that's everyone's opinion. But the third world definitely, under normal definitions, once we step back and try to actually define what it should mean, once we're talking about being rich or poor, the U.S. clearly, without any doubt, with no gray area whatsoever, is a prototypically third world nation. It struggles to provide housing for everyone. That they mostly do okay. Quality food is a very big struggle. People routinely report living in food deserts or being able to get to food but not being able to get to fresh food or being able to afford fresh food. They're really forced to eat extremely unhealthy food with very little alternative, and the alternatives are very expensive. The working long hours is extreme. When we consider the United States through this lens of analysis of actual things that we would consider critical to being in the first world, we actually fall pretty short. With housing, things are difficult, but most Americans are okay with housing. However, the number of homeless and those who actually cannot afford a home and are stuck in rather difficult conditions is still pretty small, but the homeless epidemic is a real thing, and there's a reason why it's in the news as much as it is. Some large cities, especially those with adequate weather, have a tendency to be inundated with those who are homeless. That's a real problem. You wouldn't have so many cities taking such extreme measures trying to move on, the homeless populations or find places to corral them if it wasn't an actual problem. So it does exist. It's not a huge problem. I think it's misleading just how high it is. Just because the United States is such a large population, you are going to have a certain number of homeless, and because certain areas of the United States have such inhospitable weather that being homeless there is unreasonable. And so since they have freedom of movement, what little bit a person who is homeless can move around, they're going to naturally move into a certain set of cities that simply have the weather that makes it a little bit more accommodating to be homeless. So we see it in some places where the weather is better pretty heavily, but it's worth noting that homelessness in the United States is a major thing that people are concerned about and see all the time. And in many other countries, you may not see it. It really is more of a problem in the U.S. than the average wealthy country, for sure, and probably more than the average country, period. Overall housing is not that bad in the U.S., though, but it is expensive, and we do see a potential crisis coming, but it's a potential and a future thing when it comes to real numbers. But when it comes to food, now we start to get into a real problem. Getting healthy food is both unaffordable and often not realistically accessible to many Americans. Food deserts are a real problem that are recognized all throughout the country, but even in places where you do have access to food that's pretty decent, the food itself is generally not. You have food that is not considered healthy in most of the world. Much of the U.S. food supply would be illegal in much of the world because it is GMO'd, because it is full of pesticides, because it has additives and preservatives that are considered dangerous or unhealthy, and in many cases it has hormones and other chemicals that can be body altering. So it's generally considered to be a real problem in the U.S. that getting access to quality healthy food is often not realistically available to the poor populations. If you are rich, of course you can get great food in the U.S. It's not that big of a problem, but if you're poor, this is an area where you may truly not have access to adequate food supplies. As far as jobs, the U.S. is difficult because many people, in order to be able to put that shelter over them and to eat that food, whether they're working extra hours to be able to get decent shelter and decent food or simply to get any at all, Americans have a tendency to have to work extremely long hours. They're one of the longest hour working countries in the world. Recently saw a stat that actually Costa Rica may be longer than the U.S. for the worst in the Western Hemisphere, which really caught me off guard. That Pura Vida may mean stuck in an office slaving away really long hours. Not what I was expecting to see. They stood out as the only country in all of Latin America, except for Chile, I believe, where long work hours to an extreme was normal. Of course, we all know Mexico works long hours. They're famous for how hard they work, but we never would have guessed Costa Rica. But the United States is famously a country where you have to work extremely long hours, often 2 jobs or a lot of overtime just to be able to pay your bills. That, again, is not necessarily a hard line, but certainly suggestive that it doesn't make first world qualifications. But of course, the big one, the one that everyone is going to immediately realize, is that the United States falls at the very bottom of the list for healthcare for all developed countries. Not just for quality of healthcare or cost of healthcare, both of which it is some of the worst, but also for the availability of healthcare. The reliable access to healthcare when you need it in the United States is some of the worst in the world, not just the developed world. So the average American, and we don't just mean the average poor American, but mean and median numbers and well into perhaps the 80th or 90th percentile, live without the assurance of being able to acquire or afford healthcare, let alone any potential financial risks that extend into their lives for things they didn't even do. But that's not really a healthcare risk. That's just a general corruption risk. But when it comes to healthcare, Americans live in abject fear of either not being able to get the care they need or having it completely and utterly destroy the other aspects of their lives, leaving them unable to eat or have housing or stop working when they become elderly, all because of the cost of healthcare. These are not concerns in most of the world. In the U.S., they are extreme. Now, there are other countries people will instantly point out and try to make it seem not so bad by finding other countries who don't have great healthcare. And of course, the UK and Canada are often cited simply because their healthcare are also bad. Not as bad as America, but pretty bad. That is true. They are pretty bad. This makes up the world examples of the 3 worst healthcare systems on a large scale used the world over as don't do this. Now, they all have different problems in different ways. In Canada, it's rare that someone can't afford healthcare, but getting access to it promptly is more difficult than it is in the U.S. In the U.S., you're more likely to get healthcare more quickly, but being able to afford it and continue care is much more difficult, and knowing that it's going to be reliable and having control of your healthcare is terrible in all of those situations. If we flip that and look at countries like Nicaragua, and Nicaragua is not alone in this, nor is the U.S. alone in how they are, but both work as great examples. In Nicaragua, the average Nicaraguan does have shelter. Being homeless in Nicaragua is pretty rare. It certainly happens. I know people who are homeless. However, even those who are homeless generally have some place to go, and it makes homeless kind of a gray area. In the United States, when I knew people who were homeless or when I witnessed people who are homeless, they're on public streets, public underpasses and such, where they truly fall into homeless. When I see homeless here in Nicaragua, some have been like that. The ones I know actually have houses that they go to, but they sleep outside at a private house. So it's a little bit, it's still homeless. Like, let's call a spade, but the situation is often not quite as bad. They have a place to go. They have a place to put things. They have access to a bathroom and such in many cases, certainly not all, but in most cases. Being a smaller society, being more people from your own community, it does make it easier to deal with homelessness. So Nicaragua has some natural advantages just due to the size and demographics of the country, but the reality remains that homelessness is not a major problem in Nicaragua the way that it is in the U.S. So that very first thing, shelter, Nicaragua has a lead here. Now, people will point out there is a lot of people who have to live multi-generationally in a single family. This is a cultural thing, and Americans are starting to do this as well. This does give Nicaragua a natural advantage. So even though things could be going very poorly economically, many people are able to remain housed safely, which is important. Now, for whether it's economic or social, it's still functioning in Nicaragua and not functioning to the same level in the United States. Again, the U.S. is generally pretty decent for shelter, so it's not really a place where we can say, oh, one's clearly winning and the other is not. The homeless situation is worse in the U.S., but overall, the average American does remain having better shelter, nicer homes, larger homes than the average Nicaraguan, which pretty much goes without saying, but it's the only area that isn't really surprising. When it comes to quality of food, Nicaraguans have a very low variety generally of food, just because it's a small country without a lot of financial resources, but they produce most of the food that they eat locally, whether it's rice, beans, or lots of fruits and other vegetables, and of course lots of beef and chicken is being produced right here. Plus we have fish and other things. So Nicaragua has a pretty good food supply, and while some people have pointed out there are parts of the food supply that do have heavy pesticide use in some cases, finding GMO food generally pretty rare, lots of hormones on food generally pretty rare, and the availability of high quality clean produce is very good. It's easy to find produce that is untouched, and in many cases people are picking produce out of wild trees or semi-wild orchards where there's no real care going into it whatsoever. Going out and getting avocados and bitter oranges and limes and papaya and avocado and other things, even cashews, without even having to go to a farmer's market, just going into your own yard, is completely normal. Not everybody can do that, but a lot of people can, and that does change. And mangoes, of course, the mangoes everywhere, coconuts everywhere. Having a part of the food supply, when people say there's always going to be pesticides, trust me, there's a huge percentage of the people who are selling and consuming fruits and vegetables here that are simply getting it from their own gardens or their own orchards. That is very common. Of course, you can do the same thing in the United States. It's just very uncommon for people to do that. Those ratios are very different. But having access to good, healthy food supplies, completely different. The amount of processed food is very different. There are no food deserts in Nicaragua, or none that you would of note, and the access to generally clean, healthy food that would meet, for example, European food standards, extremely easy, very affordable. So Nicaragua has a very clear win of being a first world food supply. The United States is the absolute worst major country food supply on earth. There's nothing that compares to it. There are places in Africa especially that simply don't have access to food. That's worse, obviously. But for places that have access to food, having reliable access to food to all people who live there with quality food that has not been tampered with to make it dangerous or unhealthy to eat, the United States ranks last, the absolute worst of countries who have access to food for the most part in actually getting healthy food to their people. So if we're trying to rank a third world country situation here, the United States is the most third world of food supply countries that we could use as an example. So when it comes to that, this is pretty extreme. We combine that with healthcare. Again, the United States, short of places that simply don't have healthcare, which most of the things we generally associate with the third world actually have pretty good healthcare. They may not be excellent, it may not be France or Italy or Switzerland or Japan, but they have good healthcare in almost all cases. Nicaragua is no exception. The healthcare here is quite reasonable. It is free. It is broadly accessible. We have both public and private care. Of course, private is not free. We have very good control of your own care. You're able to get care immediately. You don't have long waits. Everything is affordable. There's no surprise cost. You could use surprise cost alone as a way to rank first world versus third world. Once you have surprise cost, once healthcare is something that isn't protected, once it is not a right, it is simply a thing that someone can extort you for at a time when you need emergency care, you don't have care. It's that simple. Care requires that it is accessible to you without being extorted. One of the most common things we get from expats who are living in Nicaragua is, thank goodness, if I run into an issue, I'll be in Nicaragua, not in the United States. And not just because they can afford the healthcare in Nicaragua, which of course it's hard to truly explain if you are not an American how scared Americans live of being charged for healthcare that either they couldn't help but need, or charge for healthcare they didn't even receive. These are real fears that people live with every day. It gives you agita and it makes you less healthy simply because you're stressed worrying about things that are out of your control. Nicaragua takes this away and you have access to good healthcare, and but not just can we afford it, but also can we actually acquire it? Am I going to be able to get into a hospital? Am I going to see a doctor that I'm happy with? If they don't have the facilities, will they refer to me to ones that I need? And will I have control of my healthcare? Will I be able to make decisions? Will I be able to go to a pharmacy and get the medicine that I feel I should have, not just the medicine that I can convince a doctor that I should have? Do I have that freedom to step in and be my own advocate? And yes, in Nicaragua, in almost all cases you do, whereas in the US, very rarely do you have those options. Sometimes you do, but not that often. You have so much more control in a place like Nicaragua, and you have the freedom to easily, not just that you could, but you can easily use hospitals and medical care outside of the local region. You don't have any of that fear of, oh, you're moving, you're going to travel for purposes of getting healthcare we don't want to provide here, or we don't want you to acquire, so we're going to stop you from traveling. That concept does not exist here. So things like that, just completely different approaches to general life. So when you look at life from these basic needs, these necessities, the basics of life, and use that as the logical, the only reasonable way to compare first world and third world if we're going to think of it in a non-political context. And if we're going to try to use excess money as a guide for anything, then you have to meet these things well in order to claim to have excess money. So when we look at it from this perspective, and this is a little bit contrived and extreme, but I truly believe this, Nicaragua proves that those of us living in Nicaragua have these things met almost universally, and the majority of us are able to go on and pay for services or things, right? We can go buy TVs, we can go do these things, and instead of it cutting into our ability to provide shelter and food and healthcare, they are above and beyond that. They still may, we may not go out to eat as much so we can get a TV or whatever. We still have to make sacrifices. We have budgets. But we're budgeting with money we actually have to work with. Americans, by and large, even middle-class Americans, even the median and mean American citizens, are stuck deciding to not have as much money to set aside in case their health care is necessary and they have to pay for things. They may have to give up healthy food in order to afford shelter. They may have to be homeless in order to not have to work 90 hours a week and so forth. They have to compromise in most cases to meet their basic living needs. And so anything that they buy, any luxury items or services that they're purchasing are simply coming out of one of those things. They are having to rob Peter to pay Paul kind of thing, and truly don't have excess funds in the way that people in most other countries. When Norwegians have a little bit of extra money, may not be tons, but the extra money that they have is truly extra. They're not saying, oh, I've got $5,000 set aside, let's take a vacation. It's too bad we won't be able to eat when we get back, or too bad we're going to lose our house because we are not going to pay the mortgage, or too bad that knee surgery I needed is just not going to happen because I just really need a vacation and I'm prioritizing it over that. Americans think that way. Every single thing you do as an American comes out of, under normal circumstances, your ability to have one of those things. And typically, it is our healthcare. That is where we live in the most fear, and we simply take the chances that if we truly have something bad happen, we're going to go bankrupt, and we may not get the care that we need, and we may just die. Americans truly think that way, and in the rest of the world, almost all the world, certainly the places we should be thinking of as first world, would never think that way. That thought process, if you've ever been worried about getting health care and how it's going to impact your life if you get the care you need, you are in a third world country. Thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe. My name is Scott Alan Miller. I live in Leon, Nicaragua. If you want to help support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Alan Miller. It's like Patreon. Comes directly to me. If you want to check out anything you want to know, like you want to send in questions to us, you want to contact me, you want to help out some people who do need some help with their families and costs around major medical care issues. We are helping some people here in Nicaragua. The GoFundMes for them are in the show notes. Like I said, Marcela, my producer, has stage 4 Hodgkin's lymphoma. Her final chemo treatment is tomorrow. If you're watching this on the day it comes out, on Sunday, Monday morning at about 5 a.m. she'll be doing her chemo treatment for the entire day, and so we're wishing her well, and you can help support her and her kids as she is a single mom in the GoFundMe. And if you want to send in a video question of your own so you can be on the show, information's in the show notes. And if you just want to say hi, get in those comments, say hello, ask a question there, and I will see all of you tomorrow.